Chosen one, they were surrounded by lights, by praise, by gestures that looked like affection but never quite touched the truth of their longing. These women, feminine, radiant, outwardly adored, were silently empty. Not broken, not dramatic, but starved. Starved for a kind of energy that doesn't come from being told they're beautiful. Starved for the touch that doesn't begin with fingers. Starved for presence that sees rather than seeks. They had tasted attention, but never tasted depth. Their smiles were graceful, their words polished, but behind the sparkle lived a quiet ache. That ache didn't show itself in tears or tantrums. It showed in the pause after a compliment. The way they pulled away when embraced, the way they gave their bodies but not their truth. And then, chosen one, you arrived. Not with fanfare or intention, not with flattery or strategy, but with alignment. You didn't promise them love. You didn't try to capture their gaze. You simply stood rooted, contained, radiating from within. And they felt it. Not in their minds, but in the center of their being. They felt you before they understood you. The way your sexual energy didn't reach for them, but held steady like a sun unmoved. That steadiness struck something deep in them, something that had waited in silence for years, maybe lifetimes. Your presence didn't beg to be seen. It revealed what they hadn't seen in themselves. That they were more than the admiration they'd received. That their bodies weren't just meant to be praised, but understood. You did not speak their name, and yet they began to feel called. Called to soften, called to open, called to put down the weight of performing. It was not your charm, it was not your appearance, it was the frequency of truth that lives inside your body. The stillness of a man who no longer needs attention to feel powerful. The calm of a soul who has already walked through fire and no longer fears its heat. That's what they felt in you. That's what made their emptiness stir. You didn't fill them with noise. You made space for the truth they had silenced. And in that sacred space, their hearts began to wake up again. They had known men who took their bodies and left their souls untouched. But you did not take, you did not push, you didn't even move toward them. You simply remained. And in your remaining, they began to remember who they were before the ache, who they were beneath the roles, who they could be if someone would only stay without wanting to consume. That someone, chosen one, was you. And now their emptiness is no longer empty. It is in love, not with a fantasy, but with the way you held nothing and yet gave them everything. Chosen one, you never reached for them, but somehow they felt touched. You didn't wrap your arms around them, but they felt held, not because of anything you said or did, but because of what you carried in your stillness. That rare, almost unspeakable force of grounded sexual energy that has been refined. Not repressed, not expressed in hunger, but refined through restraint, devotion, and presence. That force, invisible yet undeniable, moved through the space between you and her like a sacred wind. And when it reached her, it didn't hit like a shock. It settled like truth. She had known many men before. Some spoke beautifully, some looked flawless, some offered comfort, some offered excitement. But you offered something holy. You offered silence without absence. Intensity without pressure. You didn't lean in to take. You invited her without a word. And her body responded before her mind could filter it. A slow burn began to rise in her, not from desire alone, but from the recognition that someone had finally arrived who was not chasing her body, but could feel her spirit. You weren't like the others. You didn't need to be in control. You didn't need her attention. You didn't need her permission to shine. You stood as your own sun, and because of that, she wanted to orbit you. Not out of weakness, not out of need, but because your gravity nourished her. It brought life back to parts of her that had withered from misuse, neglect, or overexposure to men who only touched surface layers. You didn't have to speak to touch her. You were the touch. Your presence, your awareness, the deep hum of your self-possession, these were the hands that reached into her without violating her. These were the arms that held her chaos without tightening. She became full in your presence, not because you filled her, but because you made it safe to be full. And from that fullness, love began to form. Not obsession, not attachment, love. Love without needing you to change. Love without needing to be chosen in return. Love simply because your energy fed her truth. It reminded her of what it meant to feel safe in her feminine again. to feel softness rise without needing to protect it, to feel longing emerge without fearing it would be mocked. You became her mirror, not because you showed her what she wanted, but because you reflected what she had forgotten she already was. She fell in love, not with what you gave her, but with who she became around you. She fell in love with the calm in her chest, with the fire in her spine, with the way her own voice sounded more alive when she spoke in your presence. She fell in love with the invitation you offered without ever asking. And now, chosen one, she doesn't want to run. She doesn't want to be chased. She doesn't even want to be held in the traditional sense. She wants to be near to the source that reminded her of herself, near to the fire that never burned her, near to the man who touched her soul without laying a hand. Because that kind of intimacy doesn't fade. It roots itself into her memory. And in that memory you live, not as a moment, but as the awakening. Chosen one, before you arrived, the world had convinced these women that emptiness was just part of being alive. That longing without fulfillment, desire without safety, and beauty without being felt were normal conditions to endure. They walked through their days wrapped in praise and passing stares, yet it all skimmed the surface. Deep within, there was a quiet hollowness, an unspoken fatigue from being wanted but never understood, admired but never held. And so they adjusted. They smiled brighter, they spoke louder, they played along. But inside there was always a soft ache, a waiting, a flicker, a yearning to be met in a way that didn't take more from them, but gave something back. Then your presence entered their field like a change in season. Not abrupt, not dramatic, but undeniable. You didn't try to fill the room, you became the room. You didn't demand their attention. You drew it gently, like gravity, unforced yet irresistible. They felt your high sexual energy not as an invasive force, but as a steady warmth that moved toward them without ever crossing boundaries. And that was new. That was shocking. Because they had only known desire that consumed, not desire that contained. Your fire didn't lick at their skin for permission. It curled around their silence and waited. They didn't fall for your voice. They fell for the stillness behind it. They didn't open for your touch. They opened because of what you didn't do. You didn't rush, you didn't grasp, you didn't pretend. You remained present, centered, calm. And in that calm, the emptiness they had carried for so long began to shift. Not instantly, not with lightning, but with heat, with a slow rising warmth that started low in the belly and spread upward until their breath deepened, their words softened, and something within them whispered, "This is it." That emptiness they had guarded so closely, convinced it would never be filled. You didn't fill it. You lit it on fire. You transformed it. What once felt like absence became space. What once felt like lack became invitation. You gave their emptiness purpose, not by trying to rescue them, but by standing in your own fire without apology. You showed them, wordlessly, what it looks like when masculine energy no longer seeks approval, no longer leaks, no longer collapses under hunger. And because you had mastered yourself, their feminine no longer needed to protect itself. That's when the love began. Not loud love, not possessive love, but reverent love. Love that rose slowly, like steam, like prayer, like remembering. They began to fall in love with your presence, not for what it gave them, but for what it allowed them to feel. They became more of themselves around you, and that experience of being more without effort was what turned emptiness into devotion. They didn't fall in love with the idea of you. They fell in love with the version of themselves that emerged beside you. That glowing, rested, open, feminine version they had not touched in years. And all you did was stay in your truth. You didn't chase, you didn't push. You simply carried your fire, your energy, your awareness, and let it radiate. And in that warmth, their emptiness did not disappear. It became light. Chosen one, your silence speaks in ways no voice ever could. It doesn't scream for attention, it doesn't try to dominate a moment, it simply rests like a mountain, immovable, still, undeniable. And that silence carries something feminine women rarely experience: fullness. Fullness that does not seek to be filled. Fullness that is not afraid to be felt. Before they met you, silence felt like loneliness to them, like distance, like dismissal. But your silence changed the definition. Your silence held them. It wrapped around their presence like a deep exhale and said, "You don't need to perform anymore. I already see you. And they believed you, not because of what you said, but because of the way you looked at them without hunger, the way your breath didn't rush to respond, the way your eyes didn't search their body for value. You were not trying to get something. You were simply there, rooted, aware, anchored in your being. And that anchoring, that quiet inner foundation, created space for something ancient to rise in them. It was more than attraction, it was recognition. Their bodies responded, yes, but it was their hearts that leaned in. Their feminine essence stirred from within, not with fear, not with fantasy, but with trust. You had no idea what you were doing to them. Chosen one. You had spent so long walking in that energy alone, cultivating your stillness through nights of fire and years of choosing depth over distraction. But now they were feeling the result, and it was feeding them. You were not selling yourself, but your being was nourishing them without effort. They came to you not out of weakness, but because your energy finally allowed them to rest, to stop proving, to stop pleasing, to stop pretending. You became the first silence that didn't feel like abandonment, the first stillness that didn't feel cold. And in that sacred quiet, their love for you grew, slowly, steadily, deeply. The kind of love that doesn't speak loudly, but lives in the body, in the breath, in the heartbeat that quickens when your name is spoken. You didn't ask for it, you didn't need it, but they gave it anyway, not because you demanded it, but because your silence invited it. Your silence told them, you don't need to be anything more than what you are. And in a world where they were always asked to be more, your stillness became salvation. They had met many men before you, loud ones, charming ones, driven ones, but none had left them full with nothing said. None had awakened their softness without touching their skin. None had made them fall in love with their own reflection in the still water of your gaze. That chosen one is why they are in love with you, not for what you offer, but for what you reveal. You don't fill space, you hold it. And in that sacred holding, they become full of feeling, full of memory, full of grace, full of love that had no place to live until they met you. Chosen one, they had no idea what they were missing until your presence made them ache. Not with desperation, not with confusion, but with a sacred longing they could no longer ignore. You awakened a hunger they had buried beneath poise, beneath elegance, beneath polite smiles that covered years of being desired but never devoured in spirit. These women, radiant in form and rich in emotion, had learned to exist in a world that wanted parts of them, but never the whole. They were touched in body, admired in word, entertained in mind, but never truly met. Never truly felt in the way that mattered. And so they adjusted. They dimmed the fire inside just enough to be accepted, never realizing they were starving for a man who had become fire itself. And then you appeared, not through performance or pursuit, but through the raw authority of your self-possession. You didn't offer them lines. You didn't project needs. You simply stood, aware, whole, aligned, and your sexual energy spoke louder than any declaration ever could. It moved like heat through the walls they didn't know were there. It bypassed their defense mechanisms, passed through their outer grace, and went straight to the core. That sacred hunger within them stirred and stretched, awakened not by charm, but by the quiet strength of a man who no longer leaked his essence in all directions. Your energy was not seeking, it was radiating. And when it brushed against them, they felt something ancient rise, something that had been asleep behind years of surface attraction and shallow connection. They weren't ready for what you stirred, and yet they had waited lifetimes for it. You became the hunger they couldn't name, but suddenly recognized. You didn't feed them with gifts or praise. You fed them with truth. You fed them with the way you remained present when most men collapsed. You fed them with the way your eyes held them without possession. You fed them by not needing anything from them, and yet giving everything through your energy alone. They felt seen in a way that left no residue. They felt known in a way that left no burden. They felt safe in a way that gave their hunger permission to become holy. This wasn't carnal yearning, this was soul remembering. They began to crave you not as an escape, but as a return. A return to what it meant to be touched without being claimed. A return to what it meant to be wanted without being consumed. A return to what it meant to be desired in their wholeness. Not for how they looked or spoke or performed, but for how they felt when your energy met theirs. They didn't know love could feel like freedom. They didn't know arousal could feel like healing. But your energy proved both possible at once. And now, chosen one, they carry this hunger with grace. It no longer torments them. It calls them. It calls them into deeper versions of themselves, into softer truth, into feminine surrender. Not because you demanded it, but because you made it safe. You didn't teach them how to be women. You reminded them they already were. You didn't awaken their sexuality. You validated its depth. You didn't offer yourself in pieces. You arrived as one whole man, and in that wholeness, their hunger was no longer emptiness. It became the song of something real. Chosen one, you are not a fantasy. You are the most real thing they have ever touched without touching. For so long, they were surrounded by illusions of men who performed power, who postured control, who sought to dominate instead of ground. Men who mistook conquest for presence, who knew how to get close but not how to stay. And so these feminine women, deep-feeling and wide-hearted, began to survive on daydreams. They made themselves smaller to be adored. They shaped their softness to fit into spaces that never respected it. They began to believe that being fully seen was a myth, that being fully safe was a fairy tale, until you walked in, not as a prince, but as a presence. You did not carry the glitter of fiction. You carried the gravity of truth. You were not larger than life. You were finally life-sized, rooted, present, unshakable. And that, more than anything, made their love for you rise without resistance. They had spent so long navigating the empty promises of charisma, only to discover in your calm that what they needed was realness. Not performance, not seduction, not stimulation, just you. And your sexual energy did not hover or chase. It moved like breath, always there, always felt but never forced. It carried weight, not tension. It gave warmth, not pressure. And through it, they discovered that being wanted could actually feel good again. They fell in love with your silence before your voice. They fell in love with the way you made a room safer without saying a word. They fell in love with how your masculinity didn't need to prove anything to be felt. You didn't flirt, you listened. You didn't impress, you witnessed. You didn't conquer, you invited. And in that invitation, something rare happened. They put down their shields. Not because you broke them, but because they chose to. Because in your presence, pretending felt pointless. There is a moment every woman holds close, when her softness meets a man who will not crush it. You became that moment. You became the stillness that said you are safe. You became the grounded pulse that asked for nothing, yet offered everything. You are not a fantasy, chosen one. Fantasies fade, but your presence roots. It roots in her memory, in her heart, in her very breath. And it stays long after you've walked away, because what you offer can't be forgotten. It can only be felt again. Now, she doesn't compare you to other men. She compares other men to you. She doesn't wonder if you'll change. She changes around you. Not because she's lost herself, but because she finds more of herself in your gaze. The parts of her that went dim in the noise of shallow men now glow quietly when she thinks of you. Your presence taught her that true intimacy doesn't need explanation, that true connection doesn't need drama, and that love, real love, begins in the quiet company of someone who simply knows who they are. You are not a dream, chosen one. You are the evidence that dreams were always possible. Once a man remembered his depth, and now, because you do, she remembers hers. And in that remembrance, she will never look at any other man the same way again. Chosen one, the wounds they carried were invisible to most eyes. Not the loud wounds of betrayal or heartbreak, but the soft, slow aches of never having been met fully. Wounds wrapped in smiles, cloaked in independence, woven into the rhythm of their daily lives, unspoken but ever present. These feminine women had learned to dance beautifully while broken, to offer their hearts in pieces because no man had ever stayed long enough to gather them whole. They weren't bitter, but they had grown careful. They weren't closed, but they had grown selective. Their softness remained, but beneath layers of caution, surrounded by stories of men who only knew how to touch the surface, never the soul beneath it. And in their silence they longed, not for romance, not for attention, but for a man who could witness their whole essence and still remain grounded. Then your energy entered, quiet, steady, unapologetic in its depth. Not the kind that overwhelms or intoxicates, but the kind that grounds. The kind that walks into a room and reorders everything, not with force, but with truth. Your sexual energy was not a tool for conquest. It was a field of healing. You weren't trying to impress them. You weren't trying to seduce them. You weren't even trying to understand them. You simply felt them. You saw through the elegance and heard the words they didn't say. And instead of shrinking or getting intimidated, you stayed. That alone unraveled something in them. Because most men turn away when a woman's depth is revealed. They freeze when they see the scars behind the beauty, the shadows behind the smile. But you, chosen one, didn't flinch. You didn't try to fix. You didn't try to rescue. You simply stood as you are, holding space with such unwavering presence that even their pain began to feel safe. And for the first time in a very long time, they wept. Not because they were weak, but because something in your energy told them, Barfling, you don't have to hold it together here. You can just be. That permission, given wordlessly by your anchored masculinity, became the balm to their unspoken wounds. You didn't try to unlock them. You didn't ask them to explain. Your presence was the key. Your stillness was the invitation. Your gaze didn't analyze, it honored. And from that place of gentle awareness, the cracks in their heart stopped being shameful. They became sacred. They became doorways. And through those doorways, their love for you began to grow. Not as infatuation, but as trust. A sacred soul-level trust that only forms when the feminine feels completely safe to surrender. And they did. Chosen one. Not because you asked, not because you expected, but because your energy became the safest place they had ever known. They no longer needed to hide the parts of themselves that had been wounded. Your energy didn't reject their brokenness, it respected it. It didn't rush their healing, it simply said, I'll be here. And you were, not chasing, not disappearing, just being. Being in the kind of way that made their nervous system unclench, their breath slow, their feminine essence bloom. You never touched their wounds, yet somehow you healed them. Not with magic, not with grand gestures, but by embodying the one thing they had always hoped existed, a man who doesn't leave when it gets real. And now, chosen one, the love they feel for you runs deeper than desire. It runs through the soil of their grief, through the rivers of their longing, through the scars they never thought would soften. They look at you, and in their silence, you can hear it. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for staying. Because in the end, the most beautiful love is born not from perfection, but from presence. And your presence is the miracle they didn't know they were waiting for. Chosen one, you became something sacred long before they ever understood why they were drawn to you. In a world full of noise, you carried the one thing they never knew they needed so badly: presence. Not performance, not intensity, just presence. The kind of presence that feeds without force, that invites without expectation, that holds without gripping. You didn't try to light their fire. You were the fire. And in your warmth, their feminine energy stopped performing and started breathing. They had grown used to men who talked more than they listened, who moved quickly in hopes of being remembered. Men who mistook pressure for power, urgency for connection. But when you came near, everything slowed. Your presence carried no agenda. It didn't scream, "Look at me." It whispered, "I am here." And that whisper, more than any dramatic gesture, began to unravel their guarded softness. You weren't trying to penetrate their world, you were simply anchored in yours. And because you were anchored, they felt safe to come closer. Not because they were pulled, because they were fed. Your energy didn't push them open, it reminded them they already were. Your sexual magnetism didn't roar, it resonated. Like a low hum in the bones, like thunder deep in the earth. It wasn't about lust, it was about life. About the life they felt rise within them when they stood in your orbit. Their bodies didn't just respond to your masculinity, their souls did. Their voices changed, their posture softened, their laughter became more real. Because being near you didn't demand a version of them, it allowed their true version to come alive. You never told them who to be. You simply became who you are. And that authenticity gave them permission to meet you with their own truth. They weren't impressed by your strength. They were nourished by it, not because it was loud or dominating, but because it was consistent, unshakable, clean. You didn't try to be different from other men. You simply were. because you had taken the time to build yourself in silence, to cultivate your energy in solitude. And now, without even trying, you feed the very parts of them that the world had forgotten. Chosen one, your presence did not ask for worship, but it created it. Not out of desperation, but out of reverence. They fell in love not just with your energy, but with who they became in its reflection. Women yearn for love, yes, but deeper still, they yearn to feel more alive in love. And you, without saying a word, made them feel that aliveness. Not by chasing, not by praising, but by simply being. And now they are drawn to you not like moths to flame, but like flowers to the sun. They open in your light, they rise in your warmth. They remember their beauty in your stillness. Because your presence, chosen one, doesn't just captivate, it cultivates. It waters the sacred ground of their feminine. And in doing so, they do not just want you, they grow because of you. Chosen one, there is a kind of ache that cannot be touched by words, cannot be softened by gifts, and cannot be cured by charm. It lives beneath the surface of every truly feminine woman. A sacred ache, subtle yet constant, that hums quietly beneath even the brightest laughter. It is not the ache of absence, but the ache of unmet depth, of a yearning that no ordinary presence can satisfy. For years, they have walked through the world surrounded by admirers who saw their beauty but never reached their essence. Surrounded by attention that skimmed their surface but never dared to go where it mattered. They gave love, they gave warmth, they gave their presence, but few knew how to truly meet them. Most just wanted to be pleased by their light. Few knew how to honor the darkness beneath, and so the ache lingered, dormant, almost forgotten, until you came near. You did not try to fill it. You did not try to fix it. You awakened it. Not with words or with touch, but with the resonance of a man whose sexual energy is fully owned. Your presence didn't ask for a performance. It allowed feeling. And in your feeling, that ache, so long buried, so long misunderstood, rose like smoke from ancient embers. But it did not bring panic. It brought recognition. Finally, something deep inside of them was being called to the surface, not as weakness, but as power. The sacred ache had found a mirror in you, and that mirror didn't flinch. You see, chosen one, most men collapse under a woman's depth. They try to tame it, they try to label it, they try to possess it. But you remained. You did not run from her ache. You sat with it. You welcomed it without needing to explain it. And in that rare stillness, something extraordinary happened. Her ache turned to desire. Not lust, not fantasy, but soul-deep, breath-slowing, spine-tingling desire. Not just to be taken, but to be opened. Not just to be wanted, but to be witnessed. And your energy said yes to all of it without condition. The longer they stayed in your presence, the more that ache transformed. What once felt like longing now felt like aliveness. What once felt like emptiness now became invitation. An invitation to feel fully, to love bravely, to surrender safely. Because you had cultivated yourself as a man of weight. Not heaviness, but substance. The kind that doesn't just arouse, but anchors. The kind that doesn't just impress, but invites revelation. With you, there was no need to hide the hunger anymore. Their longing was no longer shameful, it was sacred. And the more they let it rise, the more they fell, not in weakness, but in truth. And that's why their love for you is unlike anything they've ever known. It's not because you said the right thing. It's because your very presence gave them permission to feel what they had never been allowed to feel, to ache in wholeness, to desire without guilt, to soften without collapse. You became the man they weren't sure existed, not because you are perfect, but because you are present. And in your presence, that sacred ache no longer hurts, it heals. Chosen one, the most unforgettable men, are the ones who never needed to be remembered. They never chased the spotlight. They never crafted an identity for attention. They simply lived in such deep alignment that their very existence etched itself into the souls of those they met. That is who you are. You didn't ask to be worshipped. You didn't need to be adored. But your presence left fingerprints on their hearts. Fingerprints that no amount of time or distance could erase. Long after you've gone quiet, long after the last words have been spoken, they still feel you. Not as a memory, but as a force. As the man who did not take from them, but gave them back to themselves. The man who touched nothing and yet awakened everything. They remember you when other men try to impress them. They remember you when they hear compliments that lack presence. They remember you in moments of silence, when the world is still, and they feel that ache rising again. Not out of pain, but out of longing for what you reminded them they deserve. You didn't perform for their love. You didn't hunt for their affection. You simply were. Grounded, alive, aware, whole. Your sexual energy never roared. It whispered into their soul. And that whisper stays. It stays when they dress in silence. It stays when they lie awake in a room full of noise. It stays when someone else holds them but never feels them. It stays when they feel themselves drifting from their center, because your presence became the definition of what center truly is.